Hello, hello. Today we're going to be talking about ancient texts and translations of the Hebrew Bible. Last time we talked about what makes translating the Hebrew Bible into English difficult, and we talked about some of the different translation philosophies and the issues that people run into when they're translating the Bible. Today we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about what ancient Hebrew texts of the Bible we have still surviving, and then we're going to talk about ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to do this in two videos so that you have a nice stopping place. So I want to start by introducing ancient Hebrew texts to you. As you guys know, the Hebrew Bible was originally written primarily in varieties of Biblical Hebrew, but some short sections of Ezra and Daniel are actually in Aramaic. It's, of course, been translated into many, many, many other languages, including some ancient translations. Now, you may or may not know that many Hebrew Bibles in use today are based almost entirely on two copies of the Old Testament. One of them is called the Leningrad Codex. It's from about 1000 AD, and it's the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. There's also the Aleppo Codex from about 70 years earlier, and it's not complete. It's missing most of the Pentateuch and large chunks of the wisdom literature and kind of Persian period post-exilic material. But other than that, it's largely there. These two copies are kind of the best known ones. There are lots and lots of teeny tiny differences between these two copies, but on the whole, they're pretty close to one another. Both the Leningrad and Aleppo codices are from what's called the Tiberian Masoretic tradition, specifically the copying tradition of the Ben Asher family. This group worked near the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, and they copied the text. In earlier generations, they added Masorah. So they added the vowels, they added the cantillation marks, they added other traditional notes like kere versus kativ, what to read versus um, what to what is written. So they did a lot of work on the text. In addition to Leningrad and Aleppo, which are the ones that most modern Hebrew Bibles, including the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, are based on, there are at least 15 more Masoretic manuscripts from around 1000 AD that have survived. However, they're usually not consulted in editing modern editions of Hebrew Bibles, largely because they're in various libraries around the world and not necessarily in great shape. So one of the things that people have been working on recently in the field is creating digital copies of these many different manuscripts, but it's still not a complete job that's been done. Just to give a few examples, the Zechariah ben Anan manuscript from 1028 AD contains the Ketuvim, the wisdom literature, and Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Chronicles. So it includes the stuff that the Aleppo Codex is missing. The Cairo Codex, which is quite a bit earlier, from the late 800s or mid 900s, contains the prophets. So it has everything from Joshua through Malachi. There's also Codex Madrid I from the 1200s, so it's a little later. It's almost complete. The only thing it's really missing is the Book of Exodus. So these manuscripts are really important and they should be consulted, but we largely haven't been doing that. Now, think about this for a minute. The text of the Hebrew Bible is primarily being written between the 900s and 400s BCE. The Masoretic texts that our modern Hebrew Bibles are based on are mostly from around 1000 AD. Is this a problem? How do you guys feel about this? This is a big time gap. right? This is a very big time gap. This is 1,000 years in some cases. Well, 1,500 years. This is 1,500 years to 2,000 years. So for a very long time, for many hundreds of years, the Masoretic text, the medieval Hebrew manuscripts, largely from the Tiberian tradition, were our best evidence for the Hebrew Bible. We just didn't have stuff that was much older than that. Thankfully, in the 1940s and since, we've found additional evidence for the text of the Hebrew Bible, quite a lot of it in dated archaeological contexts, so it was found during the process of excavation. The oldest evidence for any part of the Hebrew Bible that is from a datable context are the Ketef Hinnom amulets. These amulets include numbers 6, 24 to 26, inscribed on 2 silver amulets. These amulets were found in a burial cave just south of Jerusalem and come from the 600s BC. They were found during a 1979 excavation of the area. These are the 2 amulets right here. And here you can see the scale. This is in millimeters. So they're very small, and what would happen is they would be rolled up and put in a little container and tied around somebody's neck for protection. This is what Ketef Hinnom 1 says. It's kind of broken because, hey, this isn't necessarily easy to read or in great shape, right? So it says, the covenant and the kindness to the one loving him and keeping, presumably, his commandments. Something about eternity and from evil, for in him is redemption, for Yahweh will restore us. And then we get the Aaronic blessing, the blessing that the priests were supposed to use. May the Lord bless you and guard you. May he cause his face to shine upon you. So here we have an actual section of a text of the Hebrew Bible incorporated into this amulet. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are texts on leather and papyrus that were found near the Dead Sea. They were preserved due to the lack of humidity, so it's very, very dry there, and they were found largely in sealed jars in caves, so they were protected both by the environment and by the way that they were deposited. So generally leather and papyrus, not going to last 2,000 years, but this has. So in the 1940s and 50s, there were quite a few texts found in caves near Qumran, dating from about 250 to BC to 68 AD, just before the destruction of the temple. And then in the 1950s to 60s, there were quite a few more texts found in caves near the Wadi Morabat, dating from the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, so about 135 AD. And we've also found additional texts from other places in the Judean desert, Masada, Nachal Hever, Wadi Sedair, Nachal Arugot, etc. So here I'm just showing you what is the area we're talking about. We're talking about this area here. This is where we've found some of these texts surviving. Very, very dry, as you can kind of see from the picture. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are mostly the texts that were found in 11 caves near Khirbet Qumran, a little settlement. In the Qumran caves, we've found over 900 manuscripts, including 206 biblical texts, as well as many other religious texts, and some letters and legal texts, mostly different kinds of religious material. In this Dead Sea Scrolls collection, we have represented all of the books of the Hebrew Bible except for Esther and perhaps Nehemiah. There's a fragment that's debated. So clearly, the books of the Hebrew Bible already existed at this point in time. Some of the books of the Hebrew Bible, especially Psalms, Isaiah, and the books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are in multiple copies. The biblical material that we found at Qumran is mostly in Hebrew, but we also have some material in Aramaic and Greek. Now, The texts that we have in Hebrew from Qumran from this period of time, primarily from about 250 BC to about 50 BC. So primarily that 200-year period is when this material is from. We already see that there are multiple copying traditions for the Hebrew Bible that look slightly different from each other, but distinct. So about 30% of the texts look like in 1,000 years, they're going to be the Masoretic text. There are a few texts from what's called the Proto-Samaritan tradition. So the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is known from northern Canaan, has its own traditions. There's some ancestors of that at Qumran. There's also some texts that match the Septuagint much more closely than the Masoretic text does. And there are about half of the texts don't match any known later stream of tradition. So, what seems to be happening is the scribes at Qumran who are copying these texts and collecting these texts are doing so regardless of which kind of stream of tradition these texts of the Hebrew Bible are coming from. So at this point, they haven't really picked an official tradition within Judaism. That seems to be the case. Later material from the first century AD and the second century AD is mostly Proto-Masoretic. So at some point, somebody in the Jewish community made the decision the Proto-Masoretic text is what we're going with. That's kind of the stream of tradition we want to continue. How intentional this was, or whether this was to some extent an accident of preservation, isn't entirely clear. If you're looking at the biblical text from Qumran, say you're laying out all the different copies of Isaiah or all the different copies of Psalms, how different are the texts from one another? There are lots and lots of tiny differences, so things about spelling, singulars versus plurals, other kind of enillage-related things, lots of small things, changing one synonym for another, but there's also some larger differences that we've observed. So, for example, there's quite a few copies of the Book of Psalms, but some of them have the Psalms in a different order. Some of them have a 151st Psalm. They have an extra Psalm. We also have some versions of Deuteronomy, where Deuteronomy in 5 and 8 have been corrected toward Exodus 20. So basically, Exodus and Deuteronomy in these sections are giving accounts of the same events. And so they have added to the Deuteronomy text to make it match more closely with the Exodus text. There are also several different versions of Jeremiah, one of which is several chapters longer than the other. So this is all very interesting. The Qumran community is collecting all of these different biblical texts, even though they have some differences to one another. So we have our Ketef Hinnom amulets from the 600s BC. We have our Dead Sea material from 250 BC up through the 130s AD. What do we have between that later Dead Sea material and our medieval Masoretic text? Here's the list, as far as I can tell. There's a scroll of the Book of Leviticus from the year 300 AD. There are some different fragments of Exodus, Kings, Job in the University of Oxford Library. There are some fragments of Genesis in Cairo. There's some more pieces of Exodus. And of course, there are also citations of other now no longer surviving Hebrew manuscripts in rabbinic sources and in Christian sources. So this is basically what we've got so far, but we are continuing to find more things. This scroll of Leviticus right here is a very recent find. You can probably find it easily if you Google it. So this is all very interesting. A lot of these texts are not in great shape. So this is the Leviticus scroll. Over here on the right is what it looked like when it was found. So it was all rolled up and not in great shape. You can see that it's kind of squished together here. You can also see it's very small. So they've given you a penny here for size. So they here you can see a version that's been reconstructed in an unrolled state. You can see there's quite a bit that's not readable or that's missing, but we can certainly tell that it's Leviticus and we can tell something about the readings that are present. Now, why is it that we have basically so little evidence of the Hebrew Bible? We have quite a bit from the Dead Sea times and just a few scattered things between that and the medieval Masoretic texts. Why is this? During this time period, for the most part, long texts were being written on papyrus or leather, or later on parchment, which is a type of animal product. And they're being written with vegetable-based inks or soot-based inks, and these texts usually rot. They're on materials that rot, they usually rot, or the ink will fade. Especially if it's a vegetable-based ink, those inks tend to fade pretty badly if they're left out. And so they become unreadable. And also, if they're made of papyrus or leather or parchment, that's animal and vegetable products. Rats and insects are very happy to eat those. So quite a lot of the Dead Sea material is quite fragmented because you can see when you look at pictures of it, the rats have been chewing on the edges, the insects have been burrowing holes through it. It's a whole mess. Now, if a text is not stored away but is in continuous use, it's going to need to be recopied every 40 years or so. That seems to be about the benchmark. At that point, it's not going to be in good enough shape to be continuing in use anymore, even if they're taking pretty good care of it. So you need to keep on copying, you need to keep on getting new copies of it, or they wear out, they fall to bits. And then very frequently, if they're in really bad shape, what's going to happen to them? What are you going to do with them? There was also the problem that the community that was most invested in preserving the Hebrew Bible, the Judeans, they were moving around an awful lot during this period of time. They were often not in safe situations. They lost their synagogues a lot. You know, this one here, this was in a synagogue that was burned. So all kinds of stuff was happening. And so many manuscripts were lost or just misplaced because if you can't stay in one place, you have to pack up your Torah scrolls, you have to pack up your biblical texts, you have to move on. Stuff can happen. Also, there aren't necessarily a lot of complete copies of the Hebrew Bible floating around at any one time in the ancient world. This is because hand copying manuscripts is really difficult and it takes a very long time. It requires often a lot of special training to be able to write that way, to be able to make a scroll like this that's longer, and it takes a long time to complete a copy. For today's copyists, who are professional copyists of the Hebrew Bible, just copying the Torah, the Pentateuch, those first 5 books, takes over a year. So you can imagine how much of somebody's time it would take to copy everything that's in the Hebrew Bible. So this means that there may not be as many copies of certain books floating around, despite the fact that the Pentateuch makes a very fat scroll. There were usually a fair number of copies of that floating around, which is why it's the best attested across time, because it was just so foundational to the Jewish faith. However, there are other books that we almost never find much evidence of because they weren't seen as being as much of a priority. While the picture changed once it started to become possible to print in Hebrew, around 1477 is when the first printed Hebrew Bibles started rising. that still didn't really take off very well. The earliest printed Hebrew Bibles are famous for their huge number of errors, and a lot of synagogues and communities really didn't trust the printed version and preferred the hand copy version. So until the last few hundred years, hand copying is what you would get. Hand copies are also very expensive. You can imagine if you're basically having to pay somebody for a year or 2 years or 3 years of their time, this is going to be very expensive. Um, and so any given community, any given synagogue probably doesn't have the complete Hebrew Bible in the ancient world. They probably have the Torah, they will have some other things. They probably don't have everything that we have in the Hebrew Bible. According to Second Maccabees, in the 400s BCE, Nehemiah worked really, really hard to assemble a library of all the biblical books for the new temple in Jerusalem. This strongly suggests that when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple early in the 500s, something happened to those texts. They were either destroyed or people took them and left, and those texts didn't come back. And so Nehemiah uses a lot of wealth and a lot of influence in order to assemble a complete set. So in other places, the Jews may not have had a whole lot of things. There's a particular example. There was a Jewish community in southern Egypt, Elephantine, in the 400s BCE, and they seem to be missing some pieces of the Hebrew Bible because they have this correspondence by letter asking about how to celebrate the Passover. And another Jewish person writes to them and is telling them how they need to celebrate the Passover. They don't seem to have all the information that they want on this. It does seem, according to historical record, that the Jews tended to keep master copies of the biblical texts in the temple, but the temple kept getting destroyed, so those master copies kept getting lost. So this is all quite complicated. As you guys can see, we do have a growing number of manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew from ancient times, but it's still not as much as we would like. And also, we have the fact that to this very day, the vast majority of Hebrew Bibles are just based on the Leningrad and Aleppo codexes, which are from around 1000 AD. So as we move forward, people are more and more trying to incorporate the Dead Sea material and the other material, but this is still very much a developing situation, and we don't yet have Hebrew Bibles that are complete and doing that work. So I hope you found this interesting. I'm going to break the video here, and then you can go on to the next video and hear about ancient translations.